Good evening. Buongiorno, back with you once again to do part two, I believe, of Society of the Spectacle. I think we're on part three of Society of the Spectacle. Hence, I'm wearing the 3D glasses that are on the cover of the black and white, one of the earliest, I just chucked them. One of the earliest publications of Society of the Spectacle has a photograph on the cover of a bunch of people watching a 3D movie, and the whole idea being to convey this sense of people basically hypnotized, in a kind of mass state of hypnosis, and that's kind of like, the starting point of what Guy Debord or Guy Debord wants to talk about in the Society of the Spectacle. Okay, he kind of picks up where John Berger, even though he's writing before Berger, he's writing in France, and he's writing at a time in 1967 and 1968 of a lot of social and revolutionary upheaval, both in France and a lot of Europe, and also in the United States. All right, we're seeing a lot of anti-war protests, a lot of student protests, a lot of labor protests, civil rights, feminism. It's all kind of connected, but there are very distinct elements. For instance, we'll be having a war in Vietnam. The United States will be engaged in a war in Vietnam, and there will be protests against that war, while a little bit earlier, France will be engaged in a war in northern Africa and Algeria, and a lot of the students and workers were protested against that war. So there were similar things going on, and there were books that were being written that were kind of igniting that revolutionary spirit during that period. All right, one of them was definitely this book called Society of the Spectacle. And if you have already read the illustrated guide to the Society of the Spectacle that I sent out, it kind of breaks it down. It was written very recently, trying to put what Debord has to say in Society of the Spectacle back into a modern context, and and that article, the illustrated guide, makes, what does it do? It makes the argument that Debord's critique and analysis of society in 1968, right, what he felt was going wrong with mass media and with consumer culture and with capitalism in general. It's like the recent essay wants to make a case that his analysis is more prophetic and more profound than ever, where we're standing in the early 21st century in 2020, and I would go as far as contending that this recent election and the pandemic and everything else kind of plays in and continues to amplify the things that Debord was saying in 1967. He writes the book in 67. It starts to gain a following in 68, but he won't be the only person that's writing at that time, all right? We have to understand that there's a lot of different intellectual movements that come up in the 20th century around certain figures, and a lot of and some of the most powerful intellectual movements will go on in France. The French, being Italian, I'm always kind of like celebrating like Italian intellectuals, and I tend to read Italian intellectuals. But and Italy has its own revolutionary and intellectual history, just like Spain, just like Britain, just like the Scandinavian countries. All right, but he'll be in the middle of a whole movement, all right, called the Situationist, all right? And it will be an artistic movement, it will be an intellectual movement, it will be a cultural movement that it was, for all intents and purposes, a kind of response to the commodity culture of the 50s and the early 60s, and and it kind of connects with what was called the beat movement or the beatnik movement that went on, in Europe and in this country. If you get a chance to read about the beatniks, the beat generation, which consisted of poets, but these were all like different and interconnected. Art, the hippie culture, once again, it's like, the counterculture in this country was once again like an artistic and cultural and musical revolution, all right? So there was revolution in the air, and it was all kind of tied together in these like kind of movements, that weren't just about, reading books, but about celebrating art. And, Debord will have a lot to say about modern art, and in the same way that Berger does, that, art essentially has kind of gone through this period of degradation due to its being turned into a commodity. The same kind of arguments that John Berger will make. And, Debord will have a very, very negative conception of art, of mass media art and mass media and advertising, but he won't be totally against art, because we'll find out that, there will be an artistic movement that will spring up out of the Situationists and out of the counterculture, that will be a kind of art that was a kind of anti-art, all right? And he'll use a term for it, détournement, which is a French term for taking like pre-existing works of art and kind of turning them and altering them, whether it be film or famous paintings, to kind of be ironic and kind of change the meaning and expose things. All right, this would be done in film, because let's remember. Okay, it's like one of the things I want to stress, because when we speak to Professor Ethan Spiglin, he's an old professor of mine from back at the New School, and he very much wants to talk about Guy Debord's film work too. He made several films that were very, very powerful and revolutionary, and a lot of his films, once again, use these techniques and these styles of, for instance, taking pre-existing films, and nowadays it's like it's just old hat, right? We have mashup culture, we have memes, and we want to talk. And in that conversation with Ethan Spiglin, we want to talk about. We want to pose the question, because when I was talking to him in a recent conversation that we had, we wanted to talk about memes and vines. We wanted to talk about memes in all their different capacities, and to pose the question: are they a form of what Debord considered détournement, of this kind of these are some of the ideas that we want to start thinking about. All right, as we move into this material, because I want to probably on Tuesday I want to screen a little bit of some of Debord's film work, and also some other related filmmakers that were working in that tradition, and including a film called Can Dialectics Break Bricks, which was basically a reworking of a Chinese kung fu movie, and just kind of spinning it and altering it and putting other subtitles into it to kind of spin its meaning. So the takeaway about this idea of détournement, the one takeaway, you should understand is that I think that you guys are like really well versed in these ideas around this kind of irony and technique All right, I'm taking, for instance, a commercial and spinning it in a way in which, kind of like is in direct confrontation with, the goals of that commercial or spoofs. We can think about spoofs and satire in the same way, of spoofing great works of art or great films. These all kind of connect to this idea of détournement that Debord wants to analyze and was part of the whole situationist culture. Bongiorno does not have enough mouse pads in his room. So, just a couple of really quick bullet points, time for bullet points. One, so we'll be meeting with Ethan the Tuesday after we get back from Thanksgiving, all right? So, having said that, we want to be prepped, and I'm going to put out there as a mini assignment, and this is a real assignment. This is not an extra credit thing. I want you guys to have questions for Professor Spigland, relevant questions about Debord or Society of the Spectacle or some of the things that we're going to go over hopefully in the next couple of days. There's a lot of material here, all right? It usually takes, I'm always kind of hesitant to get into Debord due to the fact that, one, I know he's difficult to read. Hence the illustrated guide that I put out that is kind of like very, very readable and should make his whole intellectual framework a little more understandable. A lot of times, this material, like the Situationist, will be taught as its own standalone course. All right, so it's kind of, I'm always kind of ambivalent about getting into Society of the Spectacle and the Situationist, only because we have such a limited time, and there's so much that we can talk about and watch, and there's other related Situationist writers, including one that I'm actually more fond of even than Debord, by the name of Raoul Vaneigem, who wrote a book called blah blah blah. What did Raoul? This is like Bongiorno can't even remember. It's like I love it so much that the revolution of everyday life. I love it so much that I just forget it. This is what happens, during a pandemic. There's a lot of short-term memory loss, a lot of long-term memory loss. So we got that coming up. I said here probably 12-3. It's definitely 12-3. It's confirmed. So that's going to be like a be there or be in trouble kind of thing. It's like either show up when I have guest speakers, show up, or have a really good excuse, all right? That's not to be mean. That's just, it's like when people, I don't really have to say this, but when people that are very, very busy, like college professors and journalists and writers and people like that, take the time to discuss things and with a class, it's like, I try to stress, you should respect that and try to be there. You should try to, you need to kind of be, those are like, major things. All right, so there's that coming down the line. The other thing we need to remind ourselves of is that I need a rough draft of the midterm papers by the Monday that you get back from Thanksgiving. That gives us what? That gives us another 10 days, really. 9-10 days, all right? So you should be on that. You should be on that at least by the time that this gets uploaded, which will probably be tomorrow night or Monday morning. You should have like a kind of like an idea of what option you want to take, and you should be going back and doing the reading. Going back and doing some of the reading. Remember, there is an option on there. There's the last option that includes some stuff contrasting, I think, Berger and Debord. So you might want to take that one, but in order to take that one, you might want to wait and see what I have to say about Society of the Spectacle today and Tuesday. You don't necessarily have to do that, but going into next week, you should be like already like a couple, 3 pages into this rough draft, so that you're not gonna end up pulling like an all-nighter. My journal does not want that. It is never productive. All right, it's like, regardless of like the perennial philosophy about what comes out in a one-nighter, I know like an all-nighter, I can usually detect an all-nighter because an all-night, especially like for instance like a 10-page paper. I remember like being in college and like trying to pull off these like 10-page papers overnight, and you could always tell like the quality would get like progressively a little more like less and less. It would become a little more incoherent, and by the time you hit page 10, it's just kind of like, well, let's just like call it a day and like just wrap it up really quick, like hitting a brick wall, So let's not do any all-nighters, all right? Let's plan the paper out. If you need to email me questions regarding the paper or the choice that you've made, we can talk and we can like flesh it out. And if you want to go as far as sending me early copies of it, it's like I will like look at them and spend time looking at them. But you really don't have to, because that's what the rough draft is all about. The rough draft is, the idea that, it hits it hits the blackboard on Monday, I print it out, I look at it, and then, it will come back to you. That's going to be a really interesting week for me, let me tell you. Because we got 2 guest speakers, and then I got grade these paid. That's going to be lovely. But the papers will come back with notes on it, and then you will do the final draft. You will do the final draft, all right? And then, after that, it's like, we have very, very little time left. And by the time, unfortunately, the way things have kind of been structured, by the time we come back, after Thanksgiving, you need to start thinking about what you want to do as a final project or a final paper, all right? Because you're only going to have a couple weeks after that to do it, all right? So, what am I looking for with a final paper and a final project? Well, I'll just spend a minute or two just really quickly talking about it. What we usually do, all right, in a brick and mortar setting, when times are normal and not like this pandemic-ridden nightmare, which is what it is, let's call it what it is, we will sit, I will get cookies, whatever, and we will sit like round robin down in Titchener, and people will have, their proposals for what they want to do. It's like, what should you be thinking about? What kind? It's like, Mr. B, Buongiorno, what do you want us to do? What subject matter can we tackle in a final paper or a final project? And that's like, it's considering the nature of the class, image theory, and the things that we talk about in here, about image-making technologies and the ways that it influences culture. That can be anything from like apps to the internet to fake news to different aspects of social media, the advertising. It could be about like the political connotations of mass media. It can be about art. It can be about film. It can be about a specific filmmaker. Had a lot of really good presentations and papers about like specific filmmakers that are, I don't want to, it's like you're not, you don't get to write, a paper about like, The Hangover, or you don't get to write a paper about, whatever. I don't want to like Beverly Hills Chihuahua. You don't get to write papers like that. You get to write a paper about, you know, a serious filmmaker or a serious film, you might want to connect it to the material that we've already talked about. You know, a lot of times one of the easier options is to find like other books and other dystopian films or books that are kind of like The Matrix and do a kind of comparative analysis. I know that I think last semester somebody did a really good, it was actually really good comparison of The Matrix and the movie Ready Player One, which I hadn't seen, which I actually went and screened due to the fact that the student, she was like, I want to do this thing. I was like, all right, I better watch the film, you know, so I know. So, stuff like that, all right? It could be about photography, you know, analyzing, you know, some modern photographer or some modern photographic movement. It can even be bringing in and talking about your presentation. Could be about a film that you're working on or a website that you're working on that is image based, you know, or work that you're doing, maybe a photographic project or an installation project or maybe some animation that you're doing. All right, but it needs to be like a little more robust than just a show and tell. You know, it's like I want to hear like I want to hear you tie it to concepts that we've been unpacking in this class. All right, so there's all of that. All right, and those will be, you know, and usually in a brick and mortar setting, we reserve like the last couple of class days for the presentations, but since we're not going to do that, you're kind of in a good spot due to the fact that, you know, it's like they'll be due the very last day of class. Like everything needs to be in the last day of class, you know, via Blackboard, and then, you know, it's my job at that point to like, you know, go through it all right, what it's like. So you're going to have an option of writing another paper, and a lot of people do. A lot of people like go and do a paper because there's paper people and then there's presentation people. All right, it's usually split. I usually like to split it. All right, it usually comes down to like half the class does presentations. But that doesn't necessarily, now that we're not worried about scheduling people, that doesn't necessarily have to be a thing. If everybody just does a presentation, then it's like that's cool. That's cool because it's like we're operating asynchronously, so that's not a problem, you know. But I don't want to dissuade you from writing like, you know, a paper. What would the paper look like? The paper would probably look like something comparable to the midterm, but it would be something that it's like kind of you come up with. All right, an idea, a proposal, and then we go back and forth, you and I, about how it can be a more robust paper, or what you should take into consideration. You know, and if you're going to do a final paper, you got to figure page count. Like, once again, it should be like 5 pages minimum. It should be a chunk of change. It should be something, you know, along that line. All right, somewhere between 5 to 10 pages. You know, it's like, don't think that you're going to hand me a 2-page paper as a final project. It's not going to happen. Hence the idea of like doing a project instead. You know, projects can consist of, you know, PowerPoint, a PowerPoint slides. You can do a video. I know, like for instance, and some of you already know what I'm looking for. Like I know Nathaniel Pritchett in our class did a video in another class last semester that was cool. That was kind of like exactly what I was looking for. It ran, you know, 10, 15 minutes, and he unpacked his book and stuff like that, you know. So the whole thing, so, you know, I don't know what I prefer. It's like, as long as it's like, you might shoot me like a PowerPoint project along with a couple pages. all right, of exposition about what this is about. So let's move on. So I've kind of talked that thing to death. Let's move back into what we were talking about. We were talking about this situation, this historical condition and situation that's sprung up in capitalism, specifically the capitalist enterprises of this country, that a guy by the name of Karl Marx back in the 19th century was a little bit wary of. And he kind of like saw some of the problems that might happen due to this process. And we talked about some of these ideas, right? That also tie into Debord, that you need to kind of have. You need to have a kind of toolkit of 5, 6, 7 different ideas to really kind of get into Debord. And we talked about the idea of alienated labor, how the worker is removed from the process of labor. We talked about false consciousness, the idea of commodity culture, being constructed to kind of keep us asleep and quiescent and satisfied with the status quo. We talked about commodity fetishism, the ways in which, commodities in a commodity culture, commodities start playing like this inordinate role in our psyche, and we start, the whole idea, the whole like cliche of, the person that treats people like things and treats things like people, and all of that. All right, and we talked about how in this country, this whole process kind of like ended up hitting like certain crisis points that were never really alleviated and led to a series of economic crises. All right, one of them was the Great Depression, but it's like, as we were talking in class, there have been many since the Great Depression. Of some of them more manageable, and some of them, for instance, the one that we are currently going through, perhaps even comparable to the Great Depression, if not, dare I say, looking at everything that is coming about due to this thing, perhaps worse than the Great Depression. And we need to take that, and we need to take that into consideration, and we need to have the academic integrity and honesty of like just looking at our situation. We need to look at our situation, because if we don't, if we want to keep on staying in denial about what's going on around us, and what it's leading up to, then we get caught holding the bag, as opposed to what? Seeing the thing for what it is and taking action, and what that action is going to look like, we can only guess at this point, although, hopefully it will stay peaceful, but, if you've been watching some of the independent news, if you've been watching stuff like Democracy Now!, you're starting to see this kind of movement going on of people that are organizing, that are very, very cognizant of the precarious state that we are in right now, and taking moves to put pressure on this incoming administration to adequately deal with it, all right? To adequately deal with it. And you've got people from the labor movement, you've got people fighting along the lines of calling for student loan and debt forgiveness. That's a big one. A lot of people rallying around the idea that we got to start getting really, really real about shutting down this pandemic once and for all. Climate change people out there, rallying about the idea that, it's 11:59, man. folks, it's like we either like get up off our collective butts and we do something, or it's like game over. It's game over economically. It can be game over environmentally. It can be game over epidemiologically, or some combination thereof. But on the positive side, it's like, you get enough people together, you get enough smart people making the right decisions and putting the right pressure on and waking up from the matrix, and guess what? It's not as bad, because you got people doing stuff to offset this. It's not game over. It's certainly not game over yet, and it doesn't have to be game over if we decide to wake up from our collective slumber and actually go and do stuff. Actually go and get involved. All right? What does getting involved look like? We'll talk about that. All right? But I think you're all smart enough to know what getting involved might entail. What getting involved might look like. And we should stay positive. Not positive in like this phony, like Santa Claus is coming and everything is going to be all right kind of fantasy land, but positive in the sense that the shit is messed up, but collectively we might have the power to like get through it, build a better, more equitable, more racially equitable society, more financially equitable society, more gender equitable society, where people we're just not getting one over on each other in every conceivable way. And I think that the wake-up call can be here, and it's a time, and it can be a time. It doesn't have to be a time to be like just kind of a bummed out mess. It could be a time for real lasting change, that could be positive, and life, it's like I like to say, I like to stay like optimistic to the degree that life has a tendency to find a way. Life has a tendency to find a way. First you gotta wake up. Let's get back to this whole thing that we were talking about. We were going through like what happened in this country that led up to, for instance, the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008, all these different factors that were kind of bubbling around ever since the last Great Depression, and the ways that we alleviated and solved the Great Depression of the 30s up to the late 20th and early 21st century, and how all that shit comes back around, and the people responsible for it, all right? Because there are people responsible for it, and they have names, and they have faces, and they did what they did, all right? That includes people still in the game, all right? We need to be cognizant of the people that did what to whom, and what the decision-making process was, all right? And what the rationale was, too, all right? So we had this period. Remember, I was showing you this graph where things are looking pretty good up until like the mid-70s, right? That, at least in this country, there are these corresponding lines between rising wages, right? We were talking about real wages. What were real wages? Wages that reflected inflation, all right? It's not, it's one thing like, if you, for instance, if you get let's say you got $1 an hour raise for a year, all right, but everything out in Walmart or whatever goes up $2, then it's not really a wage increase, right? Because adjusted for an inflation, you're losing money. But what we're talking, so that's the distinction we need to make. Wage increases, gradual increases, and employee wages adjusted for inflation. And we see in this graph that something happens in the mid-1970s, all right? And it happens for a lot of different reasons, various different reasons, but one of the reasons it happens is that it's like employers and board members and corporations start to get a lot more savvy at how to cut back on wages, how to outsource, how to do automation. All this stuff is like kind of working together, right? And causing primarily like skilled workers in this country to like end up like losing their jobs in the hundreds of thousands, and those jobs being shipped where? To places east, to places west, all right, where people were doing the same work and making nothing, virtually nothing, all right? So you have this combination of like outsourcing, automation, and with that, this whole attendant ideology, of this consumer ideology. We talked about the whole like cult of the individual, the cult of the CEO as the maverick who comes in and saves the company and is worth, and we valorize these people, we mythologize that whole thing, and it becomes what? It becomes an ideology, wherein it's like you start to rationalize the idea that the CEO is making 400 times more than the workers, with this like phony narrative about how he earned it, and how this guy, because he had such innovative ideas and capitalized on all this stuff, that he's worth that much, and we see it today, and we must pose the question, the fact that 50 human beings, in this country have 50% of the wealth. We need to question that. We need to question an ideology that allowed that to happen, all right? And we need to question an ideology that continues to rationalize the fact that those people have all the goddamn money, all right? And what we have to do about it. All right, because we've seen this before, and we can learn from history what they did in the past. All right. Here is one of the big things that happens, though, that we have to understand. All right. Around the time of the early 50s, when the corporate entity, the corporate world starts to kind of fight back with propaganda, all right, about, or fight and tries to eradicate, like, for instance, the labor movement, and eradicate a lot of, the social programs that were put in place by the FDR administration, all right. We have to understand that, there is a game involved, all right, of trying to concentrate wealth, of like, it's like the wealthy suffered pretty hard in a relative way. They didn't really suffer at all right, because they stayed fairly affluent. They just had to give like most of it, back into the system, to get people, but they still, and we'll talk about like how that happened, all right. But one of the things that they do to get power back is that they know, all right, one thing that the ruling elite in any country always knows, especially nowadays, by the very nature of politics being, where does politics get done nowadays? More than anywhere, it gets done in the media. It gets done by the mass media. We don't do politics anymore, via the county boardroom, or the elector, or and it's like, it's not this discussion of ideas anymore as much as it's this kind of battle of images, this war of images and strategic talking points, all right? So one thing they realized was this: if you polarize the rich and the poor in a political system like ours was at a certain time, where everyone gets to vote, right? There's a danger. There's a danger in democracy for the rich. The rich are scared shitless about democracy and about your ability to vote, all right? Look what's going on now, folks. Look, it's like, need I say more? If any of you are even half conscious and watching the cable news and watching the major news networks, we know what's going on. Everybody knows. All right? Like the Leonard Cohen song goes, everybody knows what's going on. And the rich realize that if we live in a democratic situation and we're taking all the money away from most of the people, they might try to use the political system to get the money back. All right? The rich saw this. They're like, oh shit. It's like, if we don't do something, they're going to like vote to get their money back, right? They're going to vote for measures and policies and different social programs to get the money back that we're trying to take away from them, right? So what do? What did the rich do? Very simple, my friends. It's a very simple equation. They bought the political system. They bought the political system. How did they do it? Many books have been written about it. Many scholars have burned many brain cells attempting to exactly illustrate and elucidate and unpack the ways in which they bought the political system. All right? But it's very, very easy to understand. All right? When you start thinking about the whole idea of corporate lobbyists, and getting people in the Supreme Court that are going to ease back regulations on your company so that you don't have to be paying for all these like these pesky environmental regulations that you're putting on us. We could just be done with them, and if you get the right people in the right places, like for instance, on the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, you get all these kind of little perks and breaks because you got all these people in these positions that got corporate money in their pockets, folks. And what does corporate money do for an elected official? Gets them reelected. All right, because in order to run a campaign, need I say, it's like you need a lot of this. All right, and there's no better source than corporate money, all right? And corporations whining and dining you and taking you here and there. If you just, kind of lay off the taxes a little bit or lay off the environmental regulations, or like lay off the policies that organized labor fought for, like health insurance. Like, let's get rid of the health insurance, all right? That way, it's like we can make a lot more money. Right? Let's get rid of a minimum wage. All right? Or let's like fight the shit out of it and pretend of how bad it's going to be for the country. Let's do all this stuff. Let's play this whole game. You think the Matrix is complicated? You think the AI of the Matrix is complicated? It does not hold a candle to the corporate mindfuck that was perpetrated in this country for the last 40 or 50 years. It's like, these AI cybernetic squids don't hold a candle to what happened in this country over the last 40 and 50 years, and it was gradual and it was subtle, but it's like it takes a while. It's like, for a bad idea to gain any kind of ground, it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of like constant reinforcement. All right, so that's what they did. What was different what was different about the situation? What's different from now and the situation of the Great Depression? Here's some of the differences. Back in the 30s, you got Franklin Roosevelt. In 2 years, all right, you want to talk about a guy that got things done, all right? Look no further than this man. All right. This man who, for all intents and purposes, was a crony to the rich, but had enough of a shred of ethical decency and compassion for the way that things were going that he was like, hey, listen, we got to like roll our sleeves up and like get to work, because all these people are going to starve to death, if we don't do something, we need, first of all, it's like, he created Social Security. All right? What's Social Security? Social Security is a guarantee, all right, that when you reach a certain age, the standard age of retirement, and you become elderly, that there's going to be some money there for you, regardless of whether you have rich relatives, regardless of how much money you save, that there's going to be some basic income so that you can, it's like, so you can keep on living, and most, retired and elderly people in this country rely on that system a lot more than we realize. Live on that system of Social Security in one way or another. FDR invented it. He created it. All right? He starts unemployment insurance. All right? Before that, no unemployment insurance. All right? If you're out of work, you're shit out of luck. All right? It's like the whole idea of having unemployment insurance that's there for a person if they have been severed from their job due to whatever. All right, that there's money there to cushion the blow, to continue to feed your family or to continue to pay your rent, and that it was always kind of looked at, it was always structured in a way in which it would be temporary and would help and would provide the recipient with services to find an equitable or commensurable job from their talent, from whatever you were. The whole idea was, it's like, if you were an aeronautical engineer and you were making this much money a year, unemployment was engaged in trying to find you a similar job, as opposed to a job at Home Depot where you were making like 1/5 of it. All right, but these things, I mean, it's hard to believe, in our current climate, that these things actually existed, but they did, all right? And they continue to exist in one way or another. But somebody had to get off their butt and do it, all right? And a lot of smart people, men and women, surrounded FDR, who believed in the idea that he was going to get us out of the Depression. And guess what? He did. All right, to the point where he was elected 4 consecutive times. All right, he was a Democrat. Republicans hated him. All right. Another thing he does: created and filled 12.5 million federal jobs, 12.5 million federal jobs between 1933 and 1934. All right, and I want you guys to remember this. As Mr. Biden and Mrs. Harris take their respective positions in the Oval Office, I want you to remember what I said about this 12.5 million person federal job program. And I want you to compare, I want you to look for any kind of scuttlebutt, any kind of talk, any kind of discourse from our elected officials about whether they're going to put another federal job program into effect or not. Is it the right? Is there a historical precedent to it to get people back to work by the government creating jobs? Yes, there is a historical precedent for it. Is it socialism? No, not really. One can make a case for it, or one can make a case that the government sometimes needs to, put things into place to save the citizenry, to save them, to save businesses. So how did he? Here's the thing: how did he do it? Where did he get the money? Right? Because all this stuff, the federal jobs program, unemployment, Social Security, all these things. Take this, all right? How did he do it? He went to the. Where else did he have to go? The banks were like, we don't got it. It's like you couldn't tax people. They were all like, he goes to the rich, right? He goes to the rich. And the people at the time, the conditions were this. The people were marching in the streets, all right? Demanding these things happen, all right? And there was a very, very strong, a far stronger organized labor movement in this country at that time. I can't remember. I think it was like 40 or 50% of of the working class were affiliated with labor unions, like the CIO. You had a lot of you had socialist organizations, you had communist organizations. These were a thing, all right. These were not dirty words. These were alternative parties that had some power in this country, all right. That the right in this country, the business class and the Republicans that represented them, tried just little by little, like turned into a dirty word. All right. So FDR goes to the rich and he's like, listen, I'm coming to you guys right now because basically it's like, if you don't, it's like he goes in like the gunslinger, which is what Biden should do. All right. Which was what Bongiorno would do. All right. He goes in like the gunslinger and he says, listen, it's like you either do what I ask you to do or these people are coming. All right. And they're not going to be kind. All right. Because we had seen revolutions in other countries, where the ruling class, up to and including places like France, where the ruling class were taken out in the streets and, killed. So basically FDR goes to them and says, listen, these people are not going to be, it's like, you either like pacify, you either kick in the money, that you have in droves, more than you need, more than any human being needs. And he's like, I'm going to tax you. It's like, and they fought him tooth and nail too. They went after, they tried everything they could, short of like assassinating him, but what he was saying was the truth. But we have to understand, under those conditions, there was a strong movement from below. A far stronger movement of class consciousness and worker organization and political organization that was there for the working class than there is now. All right? It's like, the corporate state in conjunction with neoconservatism got rid of that force from below and got rid of those forces from below and turned it into and equated that with what was going on in the Soviet Union. So that now it's like, those forces, for instance, organized labor, a shadow of what it was. All right, other alternative political parties like the socialist and communist parties gone. All right, except for, but we're seeing what? We're seeing signs of hope in the form of guys like, dare I say, Bernie Sanders, who's talking in a way that we have not seen, that we hadn't seen for 40 years. All of a sudden this is becoming like more palatable. All of a sudden some of this stuff is becoming more commonsensical. All of a sudden, a whole generation of people, primarily of your age, are starting to wake up and realize that the game has been rigged. It has been rigged for a long time, and it's time to fix the table. All right? What that's going to look like this time around, we don't know. We don't know. All right? So the rich paid the money. He was basically like, look, you either pay this money or it's like, these guys are coming for you. Right? So they were like, shh, they did it. All right? Top income tax bracket. All right? The top income tax brackets, the corporate tax was 94%. He got it up to 94%. All right, because these people were making so much more money than God, they could take the hit and still stay in an operation and still stay relatively wealthy. All right, but that was it. You know what it is now? You know what the Donald did? Dropped it from 35% to 20%, and you wonder why things are the way they are. All right. 94% in 1943. In fact, he even created a maximum income. All right? You could only make a certain amount. All right? He said to the wealthy, he said to the affluent this, I will keep you wealthy. You will still be on the hill. You will still have the house in the hill. You will still have the Rolls Royce. You will still have the butler. You will still have the yacht down in the marina. You will still do hoity-toity and eat little things with little hors d'oeuvres on them with your moronic other rich friends and talk about all the shit you have. However, he said, there's going to be a limit. All right? It's like, you get to be wealthy, but you don't get to be insanely wealthy. All right? So he creates a maximum income. In today's terms, the maximum income was about $350,000 in today's terms. At that time, it was about 64, all right? But just think about that, all right? The maximum income is $350,000, all right? It's like, please, show me anywhere on this planet that doesn't equate with affluence, you know? It's like $350,000 a year, you know? Who needs more? You know, and for what? For what? You know? So it was a reasonable thing. You know? It was really actually pretty reasonable. The rich stayed rich. You know? They got they just weren't richer than God. You know? All that stuff gets messed with. Alright? What was different then was this. There was a movement back then that threatened the rich, organized labor strikes. The Republican Party, or what it has become now under the neoconservative revolution of the mid-'80s, was created to destroy and roll back all that social welfare, all those programs. It demonized the labor unions, communists, and socialists. It equated them with what was going on in the Soviet Union. They were two entirely different things entirely, and a lot of people suffered in what was called the Red Scare and the McCarthy hearings and all that stuff. There was all this paranoia that went on about people being communist infiltrators, all this nonsense. And a lot of innocent people in this fury, in this feeding frenzy, in this mass hypnosis of fear. You know, a lot of like really decent people like lost their jobs and lost their livelihoods, you know. We're in a system that has been spinning out of control since 2008, all right? We are in a system that has been spinning out of control since 2008. Occupy Wall Street was a movement that came up around 2010 and 2011 to try to offset this, all right? Some of you might even remember it. You know, some of you might be old enough to remember how people massed in New York, people massed in Oakland, all over the country, and it just they were asking for the right things, and they saw the writing on the wall back then. They knew that the system was falling apart, and they wanted to make demands, but it just wasn't enough. It just didn't hit that mass peak that it needed to make, you know, to affect real change. There's numerous analysis of why it did not happen and why it came apart. All right, there were ideological reasons why they came apart, but there were also just logistical reasons why, you know, and you know, once again, it had to do with like media coverage and how they were like demonized in the media. They had set up camps in different sites, and you know, it's like mayors in different cities, like the mayor of New York came and bulldozed all their stuff and brought all these cops in with batons and riot gear and just later, you know. But we have to understand that, you know, it's like if you listen to any credible economist out there, when I say credible, I mean like guys like Yanis Varoufakis, the former financial minister from Greece, Richard Wolff, all right, the economist that currently teaches at my old alma mater, the New School. Guys like Thomas Piketty, who wrote this incredible book, you know, analyzing our current situation. Guys like Robert Reich, you know, guys like Paul Wolfowitz, you know, people like Naomi Klein, that are writing about what really happened without any bells and whistles, without trying to convince you how good the economy was doing under Trump. All right, these guys, these people will tell you different. All right, that it was a game of smoke and mirrors. In big yellow letters, my friends, we are in a potentially far worse situation than the Great Depression. Let's go in. We should have like horror music now. We are in potentially a far worse situation than the Great Depression, my friends. You know, so what are we gonna do? That will be a question for another time. Let's get into Guy Debord finally. After he like goes on like this for three class sessions, let's get into Debord Society of the Spectacle. We've already talked a little bit about Debord at the top of the lecture. All right. What's the book about? And the illustrated guide pretty much says Guy Debord. He dies in 1994. All right. We'll talk about that. All right. But he'll go. He writes his best known for La Science. I don't even know how to do the French. Don't ask me to. Society of Spectacle is a polemical and prescient indictment of our image-saturated consumer culture. The book examines what Debord calls the spectacle. The spectacle. The name that he gives for the everyday manifestation. See, the spectacle's going by right now. The term he gives for the everyday manifestation of capitalist-driven phenomena. Capitalist-driven phenomena. And what does he mean by that? Saying things that John Berger is pointing out to us in the last episode of Ways of Seeing. Advertising, television, film, and the cult of celebrity, right? He goes after celebrity culture too, in a real way, all right? We talked about the fact that he comes out of this artistic, intellectual French revolutionary movement that's happening in the 60s called the Situationists, that a lot of their ideas and their art and their slogans will be used in these mass student protests, all right? It's like whole universities will it's like there will be this combination of like college kids, all right, just like you, and organized labor in France that will like take to the streets, all right? They'll take to the streets and protest, and they'll shut down cities like Paris, like the University of Nanterre, all these different places, all right? We'll talk a little more about the tournament afterwards, but these are just, I don't know why I put this here. But it was also, I mean, it's like, I don't want to do too much of a detour here. But it was also a artistic and aesthetic revolution, right? That had to do with these ideas that, you know, according to Debord and the Situationists, you know, politics wasn't just done in the ballot box, and it wasn't just done through labor strikes. And it wasn't just done through student sit-downs. But one of the most powerful political weapons in the Situationist idea of politics, and a lot of other people felt the same way, was art, was culture, was this attempt at using art and using art and culture and films and music to really protest and draw attention to the man behind the curtain and show it for what it was. So he had this whole idea of détournement, and these would be like particular examples of it. You know, these are kind of old now, but you know, an American flag with, instead of having the stars, it has the symbols of, you know, a lot of major corporations, and this kind of spoof on the British flag, and then this spoof on the one on the far right is kind of spoofing Apple's iPod by making using the style of Apple iPod advertisements to protest the detainment enemy combatants in Guantanamo Bay and the whole like thing in Iraq. So it's basically this idea of spoof and satire and using the symbology, using the symbolism, and using the advertisements, and using the films of the dominant corporate state to kind of turn it on its head as a weapon to be used like thrown back against it. Hence this to turn something back. Almost like reprogramming, like in the Matrix, like. Think about like if one were to take like a drone or whatever and reprogram it to go back and attack its master. This idea of artistically going back and attacking the corporate state through art. All right. The book starts. The very beginning of the book starts with a quote by this German philosopher. You don't need to know much about this guy. He was a German philosopher that predates Marx by the name of. He was a contemporary of Marx by the name of Ludwig Feuerbach. And if you've read the Illustrated Guide to Society of the Spectacle, you know that Debord will use quotes from other intellectuals and writers and thinkers as a strategy in the book Society of the Spectacle. That he's already thinking about this idea of détournement, even in writing, right? Using other people's words and quoting from other people, right? And the quote that he starts the book with is one from Feuerbach, and it says, "But for the present age, which prefers the sign to the thing signified." All right? Remember, it's like, this shouldn't be a hard one. The sign, it's like, we don't have to get into this big, lecture about the what is called semiotics or the philosophical study of like how signs mean something. But a sign would be what? A symbol of something, as opposed to the real thing, right? All of image theory, right? What we've talked about from the very beginning. When we talk about images, an image is an image by its very definition due to the fact that it is a representation of something else. Something that it refers to. Something that it correlates with. Is it the real thing? No. Is it a representation of the thing? Yeah. All right? Just think of the difference between, an orange and a painting of an orange. One looks good on your wall. The other one, you use to eat. They're two different things. All right. So what he's trying to say here is like in the present age, we seem to prefer the sign, the representation, to the actual thing. And Debord will go as far as extending this to all of life. All right, to all of lived life, and say that he will go as far as saying that real life, all right, what constitutes living, in the real world, is no longer even possible due to the fact that we have been so pacified and so made docile and so de-enervated by the spectacle that we are entranced by, that we're no longer living, we're just looking. All right? There is this kind of optical quality to this idea of the spectacle, hence the term spectacle, but it's not just, and he'll go as far as saying it's not just mass media, it's the whole thing. It's the whole and he'll say something else that's very significant that we'll get to here. All right? So he's quoting this guy, and he's like, so we prefer the copy to the original, the representation to reality, appearance to essence. Truth is considered profane, Feuerbach said. Truth is considered profane. We're not interested in the truth anymore. All right? Fake news, right? Everything's fake, right? We're not interested in it's like we call everything fake, but we've accepted it. All right, there's this kind of ironic acceptance that everything is like kind of full of shit. You know, truth is considered profane, and only illusion is sacred. All of a sudden, illusion becomes more important than reality. We hold that as being sacred, right? Sacredness is in fact held to be enhanced in proportion as truth decreases and illusion increases, right? What he's saying is that as reality takes a back seat, everything that constitutes reality becomes desacralized, becomes unimportant, and everything that is an illusion or a copy becomes sacred. There's this religious dimension to the whole thing. You know, that we've misplaced our reverence for this realm of reality and supplanted it with this realm of images, of phony shit. So that the highest degree of illusion comes to be the highest degree of sacredness. All right? He's being somewhat exaggerative, of course. But we can kind of get it. We kind of get it here. One thing we have to understand about the structure of the book, Society of the Spectacle, is like if you've looked at the Kanab translation that I sent you guys, it's done in these things called aphorisms. 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 What are aphorisms? They're like bite-sized, condensed paragraphs where he tries to that are just ideas, right? Numbered ideas, all right? They're not chapters. They can't really be called chapters because they're small. You know, he'll work out a certain idea and then he'll move on, right? So it's a series of like numbered ideas, all right? Like he's almost like building a house with bricks, you know? It's like each aphorism is kind of like a brick. It's kind of like more of a bite-sized chunk as opposed to a chapter, which the metaphor might be like the floor of a building. You know, if a chapter structure is a floor of a building, then an aphoristic structure is more like a brick. All right, he's building with bricks with ideas. All right, he says, and this will be a reworking. And if you've read the illustrated guide to the Society of the Spectacle, you know that his very first brick aphorism is a reworking of Marx of an idea of Marx. All right, and we'll talk about that. All right, how it is originally stated in Marx in his book Das Kapital this is Marx. The wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as immense accumulation of commodities. All right. Debord will rework this so that it will say, in societies dominated by modern conditions of production, life is presented as an immense accumulation of spectacles. So he will substitute commodities, right? This idea of commodities, something I can hold in my hand, with spectacles. Not spectacles that you wear, but images, right? He says, essentially, he is taking Marx into the 20th century and saying, listen, it's not even about commodities anymore. We're dealing in images. We're living through images. Where we initially were hypnotized with commodities and this whole idea of commodity fetishism, that's taken on another shape now. And it's more insubstantial, you know, and it's more fleeting. It's not even something you can like hang your hat on anymore. But he says like life is presented as an immense accumulation of spectacles. Everything, he says, that was directly lived, everything that was directly lived in the past, all right, has receded into a representation. So he wants to, so in the very first brick that he's laying, he wants to make this distinction between what constitutes like real human life, you know, living as such in the world, with this idea of living as a representation of life, as a copy of life, as a bad copy of life. All right, and that's his starting point. That something has changed, even since Marx. All right, and that and the condition has become even more sophisticated. And he'll say the image detached from every aspect of life. All the images detached from every aspect of life merge into a common stream in which the unity of that life can no longer be recovered. All right? He wants to say that real life, what's out there as reality, is something that is unified. It is a unity, as such. And that what these spectacles, what these images kind of confer upon us is this sense of fragments, all right? And we've talked about this, we talked about this when we talked about Berger. That life has become fragmented due to this kind of immersion in images, whereas he wants to say that lived life as it was lived before the emergence of commodities in the spectacle, was more unified, was more holistic, all right, in every sense of the term. He says fragmented views of reality regroup themselves into a new unity as a separate pseudo-world that can only be looked at. A separate pseudo-world that can only be looked at, all right? It's not a real world anymore. There's something, this idea of this society of the spectacle isn't really even a world. It's a facsimile of a world, all right? And it can only be looked at. It can't be acted upon anymore. We're kind of put in the position of just being observers of a life that we're no longer living, all right? The specialization of images of the world evolves into a world of autonomized images where even the deceivers are deceived. All right, we'll get into that. All right, we don't have the time right now to get into it. But what he's trying to say with this whole idea that even the deceivers are deceived is that everybody is kind of in tow to the spectacle, even the people that are involved in its manufacture. All right, even the people, for instance, that work in mass media, that work in the film industry, that work in all of these projectors of the spectacle. He says they're as much slaves to this thing and victims of this thing as everybody else. All right, the spectacle is a concrete inversion of life, an autonomous movement of the non-living, an autonomous movement of the non-living. Autonomous means what? Freed up. Non-living, it's stuff that it's and we'll start to look more at this when we get back together on Tuesday. So in the meantime, if you haven't read Illustrated Guide yet, read that. Get through the first 2 chapters of Society of the Spectacle. Start thinking about what you're going to do as a midterm paper, and let's just move this train forward, because we're losing time. We're losing time, and I'd love to just spend the rest of my life with you guys just talking about all and sundry, but that's just not going to happen. So, okay, have a good night. Take care.